Thank you, Mr. Speaker, sir. Mr. Speaker, sir, the Nadi River, what's called the Rehabilitation Program, or indeed now commonly known as NEFAP, or Nadi River Flood Alleviation Project, is going to be probably one of the largest undertakings by government, or perhaps by even any other government. We're looking at this point in time, approximately a spend of about $400 million. As we know by way of background, Mr. Speaker, sir, Nadi, of course, is the gateway to Fiji. Over 90% of all tourism arrivals in Fiji that have a stay of more than a day or 2 days comes through Nadi Airport. And of course, because it's the gateway, we need to ensure that that gateway is always open, not just through the airport, but of course in the surrounding areas. Nadi, of course, is soon to be declared a city. It is one of the fastest growing urban centers in Fiji. And you can only see that by the number of development that's taking place on a daily basis around Nadi area. There was some funding, we understand, that was given, or some ideas given by JICA to the then SVT government, but nothing eventuated. At that point in time, the project was termed, we understand, the Nadi River Diversion Program, where there were plans to actually divert the Nadi River. But unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, sir, because it did not take place, we now have those areas that were actually earmarked for the Nadi River to be diverted through are now all developed. So to actually have a diversion now would cost us literally billions of dollars, because you have to pay compensation to all these people who've developed their lands around that area. And that was the idea at that point in time, was to actually straighten Nadi River. If you look at Nadi River, those of you who drive through the back road, you'll see it kind of snakes its way through Nadi town, reaching Nadi town, then it spills out past Denarau. So, Mr. Speaker, sir, now, of course, the idea is to rehabilitate Nadi River, or elevate the flood potential. Now, Mr. Speaker, sir, before I do that, rivers per se in Fiji is very much underutilized. If you look at all the townships in Fiji, apart from Lautoka and Suva, all of them, nearly all of them, have a river. They built next to a river. One of the fundamental reasons why they would build next to rivers was because boats actually could come up to those rivers. In those days, they were called cutters. Honorable Lalan Bala would probably know this, it predates for those times. But, I mean, those people who know Fijian history would know, if you look at Nadi town, Singatoka town, Ba town, even Tavua, Lambasa, even Raki, you look at some of the old historical photographs, Navu, of course, not forgetting. All of these towns were built along the river banks, and the accessibility was not by the Queen's Road or the King's Road, but actually by these cutters. Ships came to Suva, then they took goods to all those other parts of Fiji. Mr. Speaker, sir, however, if you go to those towns now and try and access those towns, apart from probably Rewa River, but even then there may be some issues with it, the depth of those rivers have actually become extremely low. In other words, become very shallow. And as the Minister for Waterways highlighted, because of enormous levels of siltations that have been gone unchecked for decades. Even from the colonial times too, it went unchecked. So as a result of those decades of siltation, those rivers are actually very, very shallow now. So apart from the fact that the cutters can no longer go up there, the actual conveyance level of those rivers are very shallow. In other words, they cannot convey as much water as it used to. This is why you get flooding. Now, in most cities around the world, when you have very healthy river systems, it actually, apart from the fact it gives accessibility, it also means that there's a lot of economic activity around the rivers. So what we are trying to do in this particular instance is that to create an economic base around those rivers. We do not have in any of those rivers any, for example, boat rides where you have dinner by candlelight up the rivers. You go to most major cities in the world, you'll have that. It's an economic activity. And Fiji is a tourism country. 38% of our GDP depends on tourism. So the idea is to have more ancillary services available. Rivers are a perfect example as to how we can make use of the systems to create economic activity. Of course, Mr. Speaker, sir, we have now seen, and I know the subject matter at the moment is Singatoka River. I also come from Singatoka. I do know a little bit about Singatoka River. Where Lase village is, you can play rugby at low tide now. You could not do that before. Honorable Gawaka would know that. I used to walk along the bridge as a young kid all the time. We used to fish there all the time. You cannot do that. Recently, when the dredging took place up Sayed-Khaiyum River, I had people from Yavulo village telling me they have not seen fish that had disappeared for the past 20, 30 years, now seeing that fish coming up the river. They have not seen that fish for a long time. In fact, a lot of people are now commenting about a lot of people are commenting about the kai. You know, the Sayed-Khaiyum River kai is the best kai. It's better than the river kai. But now they're saying there's an abundance of it. But Mr. Speaker, sir, I'm digressing slightly, but the point is there's a lot of economic activity around that. We also should see our major rivers as a mode of transportation. Now, we're complaining, for example, you know, traffic jams, obviously a lot more people, cars. If you go to Nadi town, a lot more cars. I mean, you could actually have water taxis running along Nadi River. It's a source of livelihood for people who live along those rivers, those villages. They can provide that particular service. So river systems are good from that point of perspective. Of course, from an aesthetic perspective, from a point of social cohesion, people can gather around rivers, recreational fishing, etc. Now, the Nadi River project currently sits with the Ministry of Economy because it's a major project, and there are a number of partners that are involved. And those partners, Mr. Speaker, sir, for the first time, the French Development Bank wants to lend money into Fiji, because normally they actually lend only in French territories outside France, into Fiji for this particular project. JICA has been very intrinsically involved in the work that's been carried out for the past 2 years. Asian Development Bank has been working with us too, and so has the Australian Infrastructure Finance Facility Program, the recently launched $2 billion facility that the Australian Prime Minister has announced. Mr. Speaker, sir, the Nadi River has actually been divided into 3 sections, what we call Project A, B and C. Project A is from Nadi town and the inland areas of Nadi town going towards Nadi River. Project B is from Nadi town, from Nomotomoto, coming up to the back road, and then, which is the largest section, and then you have got the upstream project. Now currently, Mr. Speaker, and the members would also know this from the budget, we have allocated in this year's budget $7.95 million to meet the completion of topography survey for the basic design of structural measures and geotechnical investigation and the test with proposed facilities, the EIA, and any resettlement that may be required, because we have a number of squatters that live around the river banks. And Mr. Speaker, so also we've had numerous community consultations. Now, Project A, Mr. Speaker, sir, for Nadi town area, will actually include the building of a surrounding dike around Nadi River. Because if you look at the Nadi town elevation, it's extremely low. So there'll be a dike. There'll actually be what we call the flap gates, actually to shut the water out. And we've already had a team that's visited Japan. We have a dike gate for roads and railways, because you've got a railway system you need to take care of. Rainwater storage facility. Improvement of existing drainage channel, because we have certain drainage or huge drains that actually go underneath buildings in Nadi town. And unfortunately, back in the 90s or so, a number of buildings were allowed to be built on these easements. Huge drains, and the buildings were allowed to be built upon that, as a result of which, because there's no monitoring, those drains have actually become very narrow. So if you look, those of you who know Nadi town well, where the municipal market is, across that, there's actually a drain. And there's a huge building on the corner at the intersection. You'll see the drain going underneath it. Now, to really do a good job, you have to tear down that entire building and all the shops in front of it to drain out that water. So there's enormous drainage issues. And of course, the equipment supply for mobile pump trucks, etc. Now, the Japanese government have actually indicated that they'll do Project A by way of a grant, which is very much appreciated. I'd like to thank the Japanese government, indeed the Japanese people, for this. And Mr. Speaker, sir, we are currently working with them. There's a JICA team that's there. We have a Japanese company that's been engaged by the name of Chico Engineering, which has carried out the additional survey and a total cost of approximately 1.5 million Fijian dollars. This is the same company that did the feasibility study, the master plan for the Nadi River Basin area in 2016. We expect to get a final report by within the next month or so. Now, Mr. Speaker, sir, I won't take too long, but just by way of Project B, again, Yachio is engineering, is undertaking the feasibility study for this. It again involves building retarding basins, river improvement works downstream, ring dikes, river widening. The river needs to be widened. There's also a couple of options. One of the designs was you don't actually improve the depth, in other words, the conveyance level of the river. You don't widen it, but what you do is you build what we call floodplains. So just where the river is here, you actually excavate land, make it all flat. Nobody does anything in those areas, and then when the water comes up during the flooding level, it just goes through the floodplains. That will require a huge amount of acquisition of land and also an ongoing operational cost, which will also mean you have to make sure nobody builds on those areas, and then you know that's very difficult to manage. So we rather go for, we had the 2016 feasibility study, widen the river slightly and increase the depth of it, which of course has a positive impact on the marine life and the river life. Now, Mr. Speaker, sir, the ADB, through a technical assistance in the sum of US $2 million, is helping with this technical assistance for B. So, Mr. Speaker, sir, again, as we said, one of the ways that we're looking at in respect of this Project B is that we're incorporating the Japanese and the Dutch management way of managing risks from flood. It is a flood risk management policy based on making room for the river to discharge flood waters safely into the sea. And then some of you who do know Nadi, there's the Nadi River, there's a Nawaka River that spills into it, and there's another river, the name escapes me, that actually spills into and joins into Nadi River. So there's a huge confluence of waters coming in at one point in time, and therefore when you have sudden gushes of water coming down, if your conveyance level is not great, it'll obviously spill over into the beyond the river banks. Now, Mr. Speaker, sir, the Project C, if I could also talk about Project C, Mr. Speaker, sir, which is more upstream. This is again being funded by grant funding. We secured that through the Australian Infrastructure Finance Facility Program to the tune of Australian $5 million, where they're looking at upstream. So one of the things that they're looking at is to minimize overlap between the three projects, minimize dependency between the three projects, which could result in delays to delivery of service, and of course ensure the non-structural elements. There have been a number of proposals, whether we build strong, smaller mini dams upstream, going up Nadi River, to be able to contain the waters when they come down and divert it. There have been various other proposals where you actually build what we call holding pens, so it become a life in its own. You kind of create small lakes where people can go and fish, but all the additional water actually goes into that. So that is currently being worked out, Mr. Speaker, sir. Mr. Speaker, sir, just very, very quickly, I'd like to also highlight that we've also had a number of community consultations last year with a number of villages, etc. that were involved in it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, sir.